Today we are going to be going through part 2 of the sensory assessment of food lecture. Now, if we go back to our syllabus, we can see here that underneath the heading sensory characteristics of food, we have covered that first dot point, which is the sensory characteristics of appearance, odor, taste, flavor, texture, also known as mouthfeel. In our last lecture, which was part 1, we did identify the sensory characteristics that constitute quality in a variety of foods. So we looked at foods like fruit and veg and the fact that they need to have good turgor to indicate freshness. They need to have a consistent colour, they need to be free from blemishes, they need to have no mould, and they also should be a consistent size. Okay, we looked at a variety of different food groups and we did identify some of the characteristics that quality food should exhibit in those food categories. Now today we're really going to start looking at the sensory assessment of foods, and we did look at sensory assessment. And we know that it is a subjective evaluation of food, and we learned that food manufacturers conduct sensory evaluations or analyses, and so do consumers as well. Now, we looked at the general organisation of sensory tests and some of the rules that must be followed for tasters in particularly. So an example could be that they should have not have a cold because this dulls their senses. They shouldn't be hungry when they're tasting their food, as this might affect their judgment. They should have 2 or 3 bites or sips of the food to look for taste and texture. They should rinse their mouths with water in between each sample so that the flavour and the previous food sample doesn't affect the next. So now we're going to be moving on to the next section of slides, which is the types of sensory assessment. Now, there are various marketing departments in the Australian food industry who conduct their own sensory assessment or others use independent marketing agencies. So sensory assessment is a big part of food product development. And when we look at food product development in Year 12, it is part of the HSC course, we will learn about how sensory assessment is a critical step in the food product development process. Now, there are many tests that can be used for sensory assessment, and we're going to look at some of those different tests in the next few slides. Now, quality testing is important, and this is a characteristic that must go across all types of sensory assessment. And basically, quality testing is done to evaluate the overall characteristics of food and to rank a specific quality by comparing the food with a similar food. Now, the first type of sensory assessment is using a hedonic scale. Now, a hedonic scale is also known as a pleasure scale, and it's used to rate the acceptability of food. It uses a simple method of faces that indicate the amount of pleasure experienced when a person is consuming a food. So it's also quite helpful when children are testing the food because it is accessible, because it is quite simple to follow with those icons. Now, the hedonic scales can also use words as well as a series of boxes for a numerical scale, for example 1 to 5, or the words might be ranging from very poor, poor, fair, good, or very good. Now on the next slide we can see 2 examples of hedonic scales. The first one is a hedonic scale that uses face pictures. So you can see one end is a very sad face, and that would indicate dislike for a food product or a beverage. And on the other end of the scale, it is like, okay? So that is the most, I guess if someone really thoroughly enjoys a food or a beverage, they would circle this face here. Now we've got the middle, which would be an average response to a food, or we have slightly positive or slightly negative. Now, the other example is where panelists rate the food using a word association as well as a numerical association. So having numbers 1 through to 5, 5 being very good and 1 being very poor, which is further exemplified through the faces, is another type of hedonic scale that can add a little bit more detail to the diagram. Another type of sensory assessment is a descriptive test. Now, these give information about the particular sensory properties or characteristics of food products that are being assessed, And it usually involves a list of words, which are descriptive words, being written on a scorecard, and the tester selecting the best word to describe that particular characteristic of the food. So a good example here is if somebody was assessing texture, then these are a list of words that can be given, and the person consuming the food, the panelists, would need to select from these different categories. Now, this is a double up of on the slide, so I'll just go to the next one. So we can see here that words. Now, if we go to this table here, we can see here a really good example of a descriptive test. So it says that there's a classification of different qualities of banana cake using a reduced fat butter blend instead of butter. So the testers are asked to circle a description for each quality, such as texture and appearance. So this is a descriptive test because descriptive words here have been provided. And what the consumer needs to do is circle the descriptions that are appropriate for the banana cake that they are sampling. So there are two types of banana cake, or there is a number of different types of banana cake that have been made, and they are using a reduced fat butter. Okay, so what they're trying to do is work out which recipe would produce a low fat banana cake. Now, this descriptive test is assessing two sensory properties. The first one is texture and the second one is appearance. Now, as the person is eating the sample of low-fat banana cake, they would assess the texture by circling one of these four options. So they might say it's heavy and it's doughy and it doesn't have air holes. It might be moist and not crumbly with small air holes. It might have some moisture but uneven air holes, or it might be really dry and crumbly with large uneven air holes. The second characteristic or property that's being assessed is the appearance. So this is mainly looking at the visual appeal, including the color. Now, there are four words or four descriptions that can be chosen. So the banana cake might be dark brown, it might be golden brown, it might be a speckled brown, or it might be pale. Okay, so this is a really good example of a descriptive test. Now, this has been taken from the new textbook, and this is in table 5.2, so you can refer to this. Now, when doing a descriptive test, these are some of the words that might be used for a sensory assessment. And these are terms that are used for the sensory properties of food. So the appearance might be attractive, clear, cold, colourful, crumbly, creamy, etc. The smell might be burnt, fragrant, fruity. The taste might be acidic, herby, sweet, tangy. And the mouthfeel, which is that texture and touch, might be mushy, lumpy, hard, gritty, greasy, gooey, etc. Now, the third type of sensory assessment is ranking. So this basically is defined as using several foods of the same kind being assessed together and placed in order of preference for the characteristic that is being tested. So it's simply ranking the best to the worst, okay, for different types of the same category of food. Now, a good example of this is if somebody was testing cinnamon tarts for elderly people. The tarts would be lined up with varying amounts of cinnamon for them to taste, and they would rank the food in descending order according to their preference of taste. The next category of sensory assessment is profiling food. So this is a complex process that ranks descriptive words to create a food profile of the product. Now, the results are presented in a star diagram, and this is quite important. So you need to be able to associate profiling food with a star diagram. And we will show you this on the next slide, but it basically involves creating a star diagram to join together the different descriptive words that have been selected to profile a food product. Now, what it does is it compares similar products. So you would need to have several foods placed on a star diagram to show the comparison of the different sensory properties. So if we have a look here, this is a star diagram, which is a type of profiling for two pizza bases. One of them uses plain flour, and we can see that through that maroon color, and the other one uses a quarter wholemeal flour. Okay, so it's creating obviously a healthier type of pizza base. Now, which base would you prefer based on the profile? We can have a look here that the different characteristics that are being assessed are on the outside of the star diagram, and the level at which the food product meets that criteria is shown as the line gets towards the outside of the center of the diagram. So if I show you, for example, the first example, which is plain flour. So plain flour is shown through this maroon line, okay? Whereas if we see wholemeal flour, this is shown through the blue line. Now, if we compare them, we can see in terms of texture and how dry the dough is, we know that the wholemeal flour, because the line is further from the center, it is drier than the plain flour. However, it is crisper than the plain flour and it is rougher than the plain flour. It's also a little bit more tasty. But if we have a look at the plain flour, it is greasier, okay, because that line is further outward from the center than the blue line. And it is rougher in texture. Sorry, it's not rougher, the wholemeal one is rougher, but it is softer, okay? So the white plain flour is much softer than the wholemeal flour. So we can show how two types of the same product are easily compared through this method of sensory assessment or food profiling. And the star diagram, as you can see here, it does create a bit of a star or a different kind of shape, and it allows the panelists to compare food products in the same category using the same kind of sensory properties. Now, the next category we are going to look at are the difference sensory testing methods. So these are also referred to as discrimination tests, and these are used to test the perceived or the recognized differences between food products. So differences can be present amongst food products through the appearance, the flavor, the texture, or the aroma. So the sensory properties can be quite different. Now, in order for this test to be valid and worthwhile, there needs to be at least 20 panelists to make sure that the test can predict consumer preference. Okay, so 20 people is required, and it can be easy to identify the difference between two samples, but these odds are too high, so other comparisons are used to make sure the results of a sensory test, which is a different sensory test, is more than 50% accurate. So this would be used alongside another type of sensory assessment. Now, there are a number of different types of different sensory tests, and these examples are shown at the bottom. So a paired comparison test is an example, a triangular comparison test, or a 2 out of 5 comparison test. And we will be looking at these on the subsequent slides. So a paired comparison test. This is basically where two samples are presented to the taster. These samples appear alike, but each of them are made from a slightly different formula. So the taster has to compare a particular attribute, and an example could be the texture or how smooth the sample is. So we can see here a really good example of a paired comparison test. The panelists would be consuming the peanut butter to work out which one is smoother, and then they would select one or the other by just comparing the pair. Okay, so compare the pair. A triangle test or a triangular comparison test, as the name suggests, this involves 3 samples that are arranged in a triangular shape and they're presented to the taster. 2 samples are the same, and in this type of test, the difference between the samples are often very, very small, but the tester has to decide which one is the odd one out. Okay, so they might be asked to work out which one is not sweet, or which one is not salty, or which one is dry, okay? Or it might be that they're making a low sugar cake and they have to work out, there might be 2 full sugar cakes there and one made with low sugar like stevia, and the food manufacturer might be really trying to mimic a cake that tastes like sugar but with, a low sugar option. So by presenting it against a cake that's full sugar or 2 cakes with full sugar, then they can work out if they've really achieved that. Now, the last type of sensory assessment for difference or discrimination tests is the 2 out of 5 test. Now, this test includes 3 samples that are the same, and this should say 2, and 2 that are different. The samples are presented randomly, and the panel must decide which 2 samples are different. Now, it is a reliable method for picking differences in flavour and colour. Now, there are a few post-lecture questions and activities that you will need to complete, and these room. So please spend some time now working through those. Thank you. Been uploaded to the Google Classroom.